They said it was just online noise. They said it would pass. They said the truth would never surface. But behind the smiles, behind the polished interviews, and behind the carefully controlled headlines, something far bigger was already unfolding. Tonight, we are pulling back the curtain on the filings, the strategy, and the hidden power moves that could change everything. And once you hear what was quietly placed into the record, you will understand why this story is far from over. At first, it looked like just another celebrity dust-up, another headline that people would scroll past, another trending topic that would burn bright for a day and vanish by the end of the week. But then, documents started appearing, filings started surfacing, and the story shifted from gossip to strategy, from speculation to structure. And what began as online chatter quietly transformed into something far more calculated and far more serious. And the deeper this story goes, the more it becomes clear that nothing about what unfolded was accidental. Because behind the public smiles and carefully arranged appearances, there was a growing tension building beneath the surface. And that tension would eventually spill into the public record in ways no one fully expected. And the moment the first legal filings appeared, everything that once felt invisible suddenly became traceable. And what viewers were seeing on screens was only the outer layer of a much more complex power struggle. And now, step by step, the structure of that struggle is becoming visible. And that is where this story truly begins, because what happened next was not just reaction, it was orchestration, it was positioning, it was strategy unfolding in real time. And once one move was made, the counter moves followed quickly and quietly. And while the public debated headlines, behind closed doors, narratives were being built, defenses were being prepared, and blame was already being redirected. And the audience never saw the starting line for this conflict because it did not begin with a statement or a press release. It began long before anyone realized the direction it was heading. And as production moved forward, so did the personal dynamics and the working relationships that once appeared professional began to fracture under silent strain. And at first, the changes were subtle. Missed greetings, delayed communication, small creative disagreements that seemed harmless on the surface. But every small shift carried consequences, and those consequences compounded with time until the foundation of trust beneath the project grew fragile. And once trust weakens, everything else begins to wobble. And as expectations collided with control, the environment became charged. And no one publicly acknowledged the shift, but everyone inside the circle could feel it. And when pressure builds without release, it does not disappear. It simply changes form and waits for the moment when it can no longer be contained. And that moment arrived not with a single explosion, but with a sequence of choices that stacked one on top of the other. And each choice narrowed the path forward until there was only one direction left. And that direction pointed directly toward public exposure and legal confrontation. And while the public narrative remained polished, the internal narrative grew increasingly turbulent. And as creative disagreements overlapped with personal sensitivities, the atmosphere tightened, and every interaction became weighted with unspoken meaning. And that is when strategy quietly replaced spontaneity, when conversations became calculated, when intentions began to be interpreted instead of simply accepted. And in environments like this, perception becomes as powerful as fact. Because once people begin to believe they are being positioned, they respond in kind. And soon the story was no longer about a film or a project. It became about control, influence, and who would define the narrative first. And when that moment arrives, the battle is no longer about resolution. It becomes about optics and leverage. And that is where the public story begins to diverge from the private reality. And as attention swelled around the project, the pressure to manage image intensified.
And every interview, every appearance, every marketing decision became another lever of influence. And when those levers move out of alignment, the imbalance becomes visible, and the audience senses something before they can name it. And that sensation of unease begins to grow, and people start asking questions without realizing why. And then one day, the questions are no longer isolated, they become collective. And collective attention is the most unstable force in media, because once it shifts, it rarely settles where it started. And at that point, everyone involved begins adjusting in real time, attempting to stay ahead of momentum that no longer belongs to any single person. And once momentum leaves individual control, it becomes its own engine. And engines do not pause for comfort or reputation. They move forward, consuming everything in their path. And by the time the first formal allegations began circulating, the narrative had already been shaped by 1,000 silent conversations.
Decisions made long before, and each of those decisions created ripple effects that were now colliding at full speed, and what was once speculation hardened into documented positions. And that is when the filings arrived, and when language shifted from suggestion to assertion, and when private conflict entered the permanent public record. And once it exists there, it cannot be quietly erased. It can only be defended, reframed, or challenged, and every option carries risk. And behind every filing stands a theory of the story, and whichever theory wins becomes the version people remember. And that is why this phase of the conflict matters more than all the noise that came before, because this is the stage where story becomes strategy, and strategy becomes consequence. And what emerges now will shape not only reputations, but careers and future negotiations and the way power is perceived within the space moving forward. And that is why every word submitted carries weight, every reference signals intention, and every omission is just as meaningful as what is included. And as the public watches only the surface reactions, the deeper currents continue pulling everything forward toward a confrontation that neither side can fully control anymore. And this is where the story tightens, because the more closely people look, the more contradictions surface, and the more layers unfold. And with each new detail, the picture becomes not simpler, but more complex. And complexity is the enemy of clean narratives, because it resists easy conclusions and forces viewers to stay engaged, searching for clarity that never fully arrives. And this is the point where casual interest turns into sustained attention, because the story no longer fits into a single headline, but stretches across timelines, decisions, relationships, and power structures. And every new development reframes the last. And once that cycle begins, the audience no longer watches for updates, they watch for patterns. And it is within those patterns that the real meaning begins to emerge, and the truth of the conflict starts revealing itself, not in one dramatic moment, but through the accumulation of aligned choices and recurring behaviors that become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. And that is why this moment matters, because what seems incremental now will later be seen as inevitable. And when the full arc becomes visible, the early signs will appear obvious in hindsight. And this is how reputations shift, quietly at first, and then all at once. And what makes this story so compelling is not just what is being debated openly, but what is being inferred by those watching closely, because the filings speak even when statements do not. And every defensive posture reveals fear, every denial reveals pressure, and every accusation reveals the shape of the underlying vulnerability. And as the sides establish their positions, the distance between their perspectives
narratives widens, and that widening space is where escalation lives. And once escalation begins, the goal is no longer resolution, it becomes survival and narrative dominance. And both sides begin playing not to clarify, but to outlast. And in contests like this, endurance often matters more than accusation, because the side that controls public interpretation over time shapes the future consequences. And this is where the audience unknowingly becomes part of the equation, because attention validates direction and silence redirects it. And in this phase, silence grows rare, because every action now draws interpretation, and every interpretation becomes content, and every piece of content fuels the feedback loop that keeps the story alive. And this is how a single conflict transforms into a sustained media cycle. And the longer the cycle runs, the harder it becomes for anyone involved to step out without consequence. And that is why the next moves matter more than the last, because the trajectory is now established and the slope is steep. And what follows will determine whether this story plateaus quietly or accelerates into something far more expansive and far more difficult to reverse. And the true tension now is not only between the parties involved, but between what is officially stated and what observers piece together, between what is written in filings and what is inferred from timing patterns and media alignment and strategy shifts. And that gap between statement and perception is where uncertainty lives. And uncertainty is what holds attention, and attention is what gives conflicts their power. And this story now holds all three in equal measure. And as part one closes, the question is no longer whether this conflict will expand, but how far and how fast, and who will still be standing once the full weight of it becomes visible to everyone watching. As the filings continued to surface, the public narrative began shifting in subtle but powerful ways, because each new document did not simply add information, it reshaped the way previous moments were interpreted, and suddenly old interviews took on new meaning, past decisions felt different in hindsight, and what once appeared casual now carried the weight of forethought and strategy. And this is how perception transforms, not through a single revelation, but through the slow alignment of many details. And with each alignment, the story grows heavier and the pressure surrounding it intensifies. And behind the scenes, the response to this pressure did not move in one direction. It fractured into parallel paths, public-facing reassurance on one side and private defensive positioning on the other. And these two paths rarely move in harmony, because one exists to maintain stability while the other exists to anticipate damage.
And when those objectives collide, the result is internal contradiction. And those contradictions eventually leak outward through timing, through tone, through misaligned messaging. And audiences may not consciously register each instance, but they feel the inconsistency instinctively. And once intuition activates, trust begins to erode. And erosion does not happen loudly. It happens gradually, through a series of small doubts that accumulate into lasting skepticism. And at this stage of the conflict, skepticism had become a constant background presence, influencing how every new statement was received and how every silence was interpreted. And silence in this environment becomes a statement of its own, because absence invites speculation, and speculation feeds momentum, and momentum sustains the tension. And this is the engine that now drives the story forward, independent of intention. And as the narrative expanded, more players entered the frame, not all of them named, not all of them visible, but their influence could be traced through alignment of coverage, shifts in emphasis, and the sudden appearance of coordinated themes across multiple platforms. And such alignment rarely occurs by coincidence in media ecosystems where timing and framing define impact.
And this is where observers began noticing not just what was being said, but how quickly similar language appeared across different spaces. And the speed of alignment told its own story, one of preparation, not reaction. And that realization quietly changed how the audience perceived the flow of events. Because preparation implies anticipation, and anticipation implies prior knowledge. And that implication alone altered the entire emotional structure of the narrative and raised the stakes beyond misunderstanding into something more calculated. And as that recognition settled in, the tension deepened because what once felt chaotic now appeared structured. And structure introduces intention, and intention invites scrutiny, and scrutiny fuels investigation. And with investigation comes the demand for coherence. And coherence is what this story continues to resist, because the more details emerge, the more layered everything becomes. And each layer introduces its own logic, its own incentives, and its own risks. And those incentives often conflict, forcing choices that leave traces behind. And those traces appear in unexpected places, through delayed responses, through defensive language, through selective clarification. And each trace becomes another thread for the audience to follow. And the more threads that appear, the harder it becomes to maintain a single uncontested narrative. And at this point, the narrative was no longer a straight line. It had become a web. And every movement within that web caused vibrations across multiple directions. And those vibrations were felt in coverage shifts, in sentiment changes, and in the subtle repositioning of tone from confidence to caution and back again. And when tone fluctuates rapidly, it signals uncertainty, and uncertainty invites further attention. And that attention locks the story into a self-sustaining loop. And this is the phase where conflicts become enduring, not because new facts continue to surface, but because interpretation itself becomes the battleground. And as both sides attempt to guide interpretation, they inevitably reveal their priorities. And what they prioritize exposes what they fear most. And fear is the most revealing signal in any power struggle. And fear has many forms here. Fear of precedent, fear of exposure, fear of association, fear of silence, and fear of escalation. And each fear generates its own strategy, and those strategies often collide with one another because they are built to defend different vulnerabilities. And once defensive strategies diverge, the coherence of any unified front weakens, and fragmentation becomes visible, not as open disagreement, but as misaligned emphasis. And when emphasis misaligns, audiences notice, even if they cannot articulate how. And that noticing becomes another pressure point, another source of instability within an already strained narrative. And all of this unfolds under the surface of the public story, which continues to present itself as composed and controlled. And this contrast between surface control and underlying turbulence is what generates suspense, because viewers sense the dissonance and remain engaged, searching for the moment when alignment finally breaks and something undeniable emerges. And the longer that moment delays, the greater the tension grows, because delayed resolution heightens anticipation, and anticipation increases the emotional investment of the audience. And once emotional investment takes hold, disengagement becomes unlikely, because viewers now seek not just information, but closure. And closure remains elusive precisely because the narrative continues to unfold, to expand sideways rather than forward. And each sideways expansion introduces new angles, new questions, and new fault lines. And as these fault lines multiply, the simple frameworks that once explained the story begin to fail. And when frameworks fail, audiences feel compelled to search for new ones. And that search keeps them watching, listening, and analyzing. And at this stage, the conflict is no longer contained within its original boundaries. It has become symbolic of broader themes: influence, access, reputation, control, narrative power, and the cost of public visibility. And once a story becomes symbolic, it attracts attention from beyond the original audience, because people begin seeing reflections of other conflicts within it. And this cross-identification amplifies reach and endurance. And now the story is not just about what happened, it is about what it represents. And representation carries far more weight than isolated incident, because representation influences how future conflicts will be interpreted and how future claims will be received. And that is why the struggle over narrative control intensifies as symbolic weight grows, because the outcome will not only determine immediate consequences, but will help establish expectations moving forward. And those expectations shape behavior long after the headlines fade. And as both sides maneuver within this environment, each decision becomes layered with both immediate and long-term implications. And such layering makes hesitation costly and impulsiveness risky. And the margin for error narrows with every additional observer. And this narrowing margin is the invisible force that now governs the rhythm of the conflict, because it dictates how fast moves can be made, how carefully they must be framed, and how much silence can be tolerated before it becomes suspicious. And the balance between action and inaction grows increasingly delicate, and any miscalculation can tip perception dramatically in one direction or the other. And this is why the pacing of developments now feels both slow and intense, because while visible changes occur incrementally, the underlying pressure accelerates continuously. And compressed pressure is the most volatile state, because it stores energy that seeks release. And when that release arrives, it often exceeds expectations. And this anticipation of release keeps the audience locked in, watching for the fracture point, the moment when the structure can no longer contain the accumulated tension and something gives. And until that moment arrives, every development is read not as an endpoint, but as a prelude. And this is the psychological architecture that now sustains the story and makes it resistant to fatigue. Because each new detail is perceived not as resolution, but as setup. And the audience does not ask whether more will come, they ask when and in what form. And that question alone keeps attention anchored. And as part 2 closes, the atmosphere surrounding the conflict feels heavier, not because clarity has increased, but because complexity has deepened. And complexity signals that the surface story remains only one layer among many, still in motion beneath it. As this story continues to unfold, what becomes unmistakably clear is that this is no longer about a single dispute, a single headline, or a single moment in time. It has grown into a layered conflict built on perception, power, reputation, and control. Every filing, every response, every silence now carries meaning, and none of it exists in isolation, because each move reshapes how the last one is understood and what the next one might reveal. The audience is no longer just watching events, they're watching strategy unfold in real time, and that is what makes this moment so compelling. The answers are not arriving all at once, they're forming slowly through alignment, timing, and pattern. And the truth, when it fully emerges, will not arrive as a surprise, but as a confirmation of what the clues have been quietly pointing toward all along. The tension now is not whether this story will reach a turning point, but how irreversible that turning point will be and who will still have control once it arrives. Until then, every step taken, every word chosen, and every silence held will continue to shape the outcome. And the final chapter is still being written right now, in real time, just beyond the edge of the public view.